Advocates calling for further reparations following the final report into missing children and unmarked graves at residential schools. The report outlines 42 obligations of governments, churches, and institutions regarding all the children who never returned home. Joining us with more on the report this morning is Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with residential schools. Great to have you here, Ms. Murray. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you to delve further into what you called a culture of amnesty and a culture of impunity when it comes to Canada and reparations. What does that mean?
Essentially, what I've identified in the report is the mechanisms and the ways in which Canada has blocked avenues for Indigenous peoples and survivors and families of those children that never made it home to obtain accountability and justice for the harms and genocide and crimes against humanity that were perpetrated against them. And
the amnesty is being offered then in your report to Canada as opposed to the children who were taken and forced to attend schools?
Absolutely. The government of Canada has protected the perpetrators of the harms more than it ever did to protect the children that were taken and harmed inside the Indian residential schools. And they did this in many different ways by not signing on to a number of international conventions that would have allowed for avenues of justice and accountability and would have provided numerous obligations on Canada to ensure that these harms did not happen. One example is the crime against enforced disappearances. I spend a lot of time in my final report speaking about the fact that many of these children aren't just missing, they have been forcibly disappeared by the state, and that the crime is continuing today because that crime continues if the government continues to conceal the fact of the fate and the fact of where they're buried from Indigenous families. And that's what's happening when we don't have access to the documentation that's needed to find these children.
And just to make that clearer for people, when you change the language from missing children to enforced disappearance, that denotes a crime. Is that correct?
That's correct. Enforced disappearance is a crime against humanity. It's a criminal crime, and it's also a breach of human rights.
I'm so fascinated in this report as well that you set up a legal framework. So we've had calls for apology, we've had calls for disclosure, both of which are also still necessary. But this legal framework outlined in here will make a real difference. Can you tell us about how it pushes reparations forward?
Absolutely. My mandate asked me to make recommendations for a new legal framework because our current framework in Canada is not sufficient. And over the 2 years of my mandate, I discovered that tinkering around with the current legislation isn't enough. We need to make some bold changes. We need to bring in some new legislation, and we need to bring legislation that will repatriate the remains of these children to their home communities and their families. We need legislation to rematriate, return lands to Indigenous people. We need a Federal Truth Act to ensure that we know who holds records in relation to Indigenous peoples and these children, and to ensure that these records no longer get destroyed and they get returned to Indigenous peoples.
One of the areas of legal that I find really interesting as well is to criminalize residential school deniers. This is a segment of the population who has denied the existence of these burial sites. And you address that by saying that this should be criminalized by being a residential school denier. Can you explain that further?
Absolutely. I'm calling for an amendment to the criminal code to make it a crime to willfully incite hate against Indigenous people by downplaying Indian residential schools and denying that they occurred. It's very harmful and traumatic and re-victimizes Indigenous families and communities when this type of hate and hate activities continues to happen in this country. And it's part of the culture of impunity. It's part of the amnesty. If Canada continues to not speak up and say that we know kids died in these institutions, we know that they're buried on these grounds, and we're not going to allow this hate to be directed at Indigenous people, they're again protecting the perpetrators. And so I'm calling for an amendment to the criminal code to criminalize this type of activity.
Kimberly Murray, I want to thank you not only for the work that you have done, but also taking time to come on and talk to us more about it here on Your Morning. Great to have you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.